What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Hopefully you guys had a good week. It was a quiet week on the Steelers front. It was actually kind of a good thing. Allowed me to kind of reset, get to some draft prospects that I've been wanting to get to since the combine. But first week of free agency was absolutely bonkers from a Pittsburgh perspective. And then the second week was pretty much all crickets. The Steelers didn't really make any moves. But I think it's a good time now that we've got this kind of first wave kind of over with. I want to kind of step back a little bit, look at what the Steelers have done with the roster so far, and then kind of talk a little bit about where the team's going to be headed as we are about a month away now from draft season. So really excited about that. Just before we get started, y'all do me a favor, just like the video, subscribe, turn on notifications, all that good stuff. Drop me a comment on what you guys think. But yeah, we're going to go over kind of like a free agency recap is kind of how I'm titling the video. And then also I'm going to take some questions from Twitter last night as well. So we'll do the free agency recap first, questions afterwards. But I'm excited to get on here and talk some ball. So without further ado, let's take a look at the free agency recap for the Steelers. Legal tampering period started last Monday. These are the kind of additions and subtractions that have taken place since then. I'm going to kind of go over these players a little bit individually and then just kind of take back and, look at it from a broader perspective. But, I think the big thing, overhauling the quarterback room, really impressive by Omar Khan, out, Mason Rudolph, Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky, all three quarterbacks from last season are now going to be with new teams in 2024. And then they bring in Russell Wilson. Unique situation there, with Denver at the offset language in his contract. They're going to end up paying him, the veteran minimum, which is a little over $1 million for 2024. I just think the value there, even if Russ isn't, no longer that kind of star quarterback, the value there of getting somebody who's won a Super Bowl, who I think can at least provide you baseline quarterback play for that type of contract. Been in big games, got playoff experience. I think that, adding him to the mix really, to me, tells me that the Steelers are really, they're trying to make a playoff push. They're trying to win a playoff game. This playoff drought has been going on for far too long. I think adding him to the mix signals that, they think that they've got the defense in place to do that, to be competitive in the AFC. And we'll see, how that plan shakes out for them. I think we all kind of expected them to add a veteran quarterback to the equation. Full transparency, did not expect, the Kenny Pickett situation to unfold like it did. Just how quickly everything transpired with him getting traded to Philly. But I thought the value that they got back, adding another top 100 pick, in that pick swap, I thought the value that they got back was really strong. So, and then, trading a 6th-round pick for Justin Fields. So really between Fields and Wilson, I mean, they're spending about less than $5 million of their cap space this season on two quarterbacks that I think are, in my opinion, better than any of the guys they started last season. So I think that is encouraging. I'm optimistic that at least one of those two quarterbacks are going to be able to give them quality quarterback play next season, which is really what's been missing, I feel like, over the past several years. And I'm excited to see how Arthur Smith kind of constructs the offense around those guys. But, for Khan to go out and get not one, but two quarterbacks, I think two quarterbacks that a lot of Steelers fans, have been asking me about throughout the offseason, it's pretty cool. So, the big kind of splash, quote unquote, move that they made was adding Patrick Queen to the equation, inside linebacker for Baltimore. That was, we had talked about, that I thought that they were going to make a, one relatively big move, like not anything too crazy, but, I think Queen definitely qualifies as that. I think you just look at the contract, man, like what they got him for, only $13 million. Guaranteed, I think that makes him like the 6th or 7th highest paid linebacker on an APY basis, a little over 13 million there. I just think that the value is pretty good. I think Queen's best ball is ahead of him, man. He's going to be 25 years old this season. I think he's a really, really strong player, does a lot of things really well. Again, I think the biggest thing for me was just adding athleticism in the back seven. That was really key for me. One of the things that I wanted them to do this offseason, one of the things I thought they needed to prioritize, because last season I just felt like the lack of speed was really notable in the back end, and Queen can really fly. So I'm excited about seeing how Queen fits into the equation. A couple other like solid veteran additions, Deshaun Elliott. I've been watching his film over the past couple of days when I can, just to try, because I want to do a film breakdown on him for the channel, maybe have that up in the next day or two. Been impressed by Elliott though. Like I think he's a really smart player. Seems to always be in the right position. I've been impressed by some of the length at the catch point showing up, getting his hands in passing lanes, things like that. And I think he's a really good tackler. Like he's been a sub 10% tackler over the past 2 seasons. I've seen him make some absolutely awesome stops in the open field on tailbacks. And, I think that he's going to be a good starter next to Minka. I don't think that Elliott is necessarily like he's one of those players that I don't know if he has like this trait or attribute necessarily that gets me extremely excited. He just seems like extremely well rounded. I think he can do a little bit of everything, and he's just kind of that quality. Like, I use this kind of expression sometimes on Twitter, but you need some like 78, 80 overalls on your team, like starter guys that are relatively cheap deals, veterans who have been around a long time that aren't going to make mistakes. Those type of guys, especially for the contract that they got Elliott for. I think he definitely fits that description. I think he's going to be able to play solid ball. Cameron Johnston, I think we can all probably agree that the Presley Harvin experience probably lasted too long, in my opinion. Just the general inconsistency for Harvin over the past couple of seasons been tough. When you spend a draft pick on a specialist, you ideally, you definitely want those guys to hit. But, Harvin just really, like I said, the inconsistency, I feel like they needed to go out and get a veteran punter. Johnson's a guy who I think, made a lot of sense. They ended up making him one of the higher paid punters. I'm not exactly sure of where he ranks in the league, but I definitely think he gives them an upgrade there. And for the Steelers too, they're going to be in some close games, right? Like last season, they were in all these, kind of close games that came down to the wire. And when you play that type of ball, special teams is really important. I just looked it up. Johnson's the 8th highest paid punter in the league. I feel like that's fine. So, I think maybe the most surprising or maybe the move that I think is the most kind of intricate to kind of go through the weeds on is the Dante Jackson for Deontay Johnson trade. Basically straight up. I mean, it was a day 3 pick swap involved, but really not much value to really speak of there. I feel like I wrote about this on Twitter, and I've wrote about it a little bit for Steelers Now as well. When you compare the players, Jackson to Johnson, 1-to-1, it's not really a fair comparison, in my opinion, because for one, I think Johnson just has some traits that I think set him apart, even if he does have some inconsistencies on his own. The route running, the ability to separate, those are very valuable things for a wide receiver to possess. I think Deontay is definitely a baseline wide receiver 1, high end wide receiver 2 at the very worst, in my opinion. When I was going through Jackson's film, the film room is up on the channel if you guys want to see it. But I didn't see that type of player. Like I saw like kind of a baseline CB2, high-end CB3 type of guy, assuming he's healthy. He's had some injury stuff. He tore his Achilles in 2022. But I thought for the most part, his athleticism looked in place last season for Carolina. But again, another guy that has a lot of peaks and valleys, right, in his play. But I think on the surface, when the trade was first announced and stuff, even as I was just now getting into the film, I just didn't really understand the rationale. I understood that, they had to move on from Johnson because that was the direction that, he and the team wanted to go in. They needed a fresh start on both sides for a myriad of different reasons that I'm not going to get into again in this video. But, I just thought that, the value itself, it just didn't make a lot of sense. Now, since that has happened, Dante Jackson's reworked his contract. So he had like a 15 million or something like that cap hit for this season that got reworked. Now he's only going to have like a $6 million cap hit. So it's hard for me I'm not going to judge the trade in a 1-for-1 scenario anymore because the Steelers created about 9 or 10 million in cap space, right? And we'll talk about the cap space that they have, some of the options they have available before they get to draft season. But for me, I got to see what they do with that 9 or 10 million before I really say that, okay, like I don't like the trade or I do like the trade. I have a pretty good feeling about like the type of play that Jackson's going to bring to the table. But, if they go out there and they spend that $9 million wisely and, they make a trade and go get another playmaker on the outside, then I'll feel differently about it. So that's just kind of how I feel. Van Jefferson, wide receiver, a guy that was familiar, to Arthur Smith. They traded for him in Atlanta last season, midseason. Wasn't very productive. Really, his best season came 2 years ago, or I guess now 3 years ago in LA. He got off to a really good start, helped the Rams, win a Super Bowl, was a big time target for Matt Stafford down the field, made some big plays. But again, kind of usually when players are, talented. And I think Van Jefferson has some talent, has some size, a little bit of route running ability, the ability to stretch the field vertically. Usually when guys like that don't put it together, there's some inconsistencies in their play. And I feel like with Jefferson, it's really a lot to do with the hands. Like I think his hands are really inconsistent. The technique aspect of it, some really bad concentration drops too on film. But I think as far as like a wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5, a guy that can play inside outside, he's got some size, which we know Arthur Smith prefers, and then a guy who's a pretty dedicated blocker as well. I think that makes sense. Maybe a guy that could fill that kind of Allen Robinson veteran leader / blocker role. And his contract hasn't actually been announced. I just know it's a 1-year deal, but I'm assuming it's probably for the vet minimum. So something similar to that. So, the other subtractions, Chuks Okorafor, he was let go before free agency even began, quickly inked a contract with the Patriots. Looks like he's going to have a chance to maybe be the swing tackle or compete for a starting job there. Good for Chuks. I definitely think the move on there makes a lot of sense. I was really hoping that they were going to be able to get Armon Watts back because I felt like he was really solid depth for them last season. He was a guy that when they signed him in the offseason last year, I did a video on, and I was pretty impressed by what I saw. I thought that he had a chance to be a contributor, and turns out, he ends up making the roster, and I felt like he was one of their better depth pieces on the defensive line. That's going to be a question moving forward too. Like, the Steelers starters, they're running it back. They're, Cam Hayward has a high cap hit, but he's going to be back. Ogunjobi has a high cap hit, but he's going to be back, it looks like. And then Keanu Benton coming off a strong rookie season. The starters are in place, but, they've got some questions, I feel like, behind them. They were able to retain Montravius Adams. They brought him back into the fold. Isaiah Loudermilk, another guy that, could play into that mix, but with DeMarvin Leal's development being, really non-existent up to this point, there's probably going to need to be some type of defensive line addition at some point on draft weekend just to give a little bit more juice when those guys have to take breathers or off the field. So, and then I think this move happened a day or two ago. James Pierre signed with Washington. Pierre is another guy kind of fit the mold of like that bigger press corner that they have been after the past couple of seasons, but, just never really fully put those tools together. I thought he had some nice moments. I think back to the Raiders game a couple years ago and some of the things that he did early on, I think in like 2020 or 2021. But, I think, the big thing that you're going to miss there is the special teams acumen, right? Like being a gunner, you need those guys to fill those roles. Who that's going to be next season is going to be interesting. They were able to bring back Miles Killebrew. I thought that was a good idea as well, just because, you don't want to lose too many guys off those special teams unit. You kind of want some pillars there. And I think Killebrew's definitely proven himself to be that caliber of player. So just kind of looking at where the Steelers are now with cap space, I'm not really sure. Some people are more familiar with this stuff than others. So I'll try to break this down as cleanly as I possibly can. I use my cap stuff, probably 95% of it comes from overthecap.com. So you guys can visit that if you want to do some of your own research. They have the Steelers at $14.3 million in cap space right now. That does not take into account Van Jefferson's contract and the top 51. So right now they're about $14 million. If you account for Jefferson's cap hit and how things would work out after that, they're about $14 million over the cap. Now, to that point, the rookie draft class that they've got with the picks that they're slated to have is going to cost them a little over $9 million. So there's where kind of a chunk of that needs to go. And then they've got, full restructure options available on some players as well. You can always restructure those contracts with the signing bonus, things like that. The biggest one, TJ Watt, they could save a little over or nearly $10 million if they fully restructure his deal. Micah Fitzpatrick's about $9 million. Alex Hassman's about $7 million. So about $26 million or so between those three players of, workable cap space if they choose to use it. Now, it would surprise me a little bit if they used all of it, but I do think at least one, probably two of those guys are going to end up getting restructured so that they can maybe make another move or two. We'll see kind of what that looks like as we move on. But the Steelers they do have a little bit of wiggle room. They typically like to go into the season with like 8 or 10 million in cap space. And really that's for obvious reasons, right? Guys get hurt. Maybe a guy comes available, you have to go out and get a certain position. all those different things. You just want that flexibility, man. Like trade deadline stuff, you want that flexibility to kind of work guys in if you need to, and we'll see what that looks like down the road. But that kind of gives you guys, at least a little bit of an indication of where they sit with the cap right now. So I do, like I said, want to get to some questions. I asked a little Q&A on Twitter, so I'm going to answer those now. Appreciate everybody for asking questions. If you did put something in here, I'll try to get to all these. It looks like a little smaller of a pool than we've had the past couple times. I didn't end up tweeting this out at an ideal time or retweet it. So I think we got some good stuff in here. You think there's a lot of questions in here about trades, like trading down. So I'll probably loop all those in together. But you think there's any chance Omar says screw it and trades back into the third, even in the second round, due to his draft class not being very deep? So when I said, I've said this a couple times in different forums that this draft class isn't very deep, I'm more so talking about like the late fifth, like late day three types. This just isn't a very deep draft class. So I think that there's going to be some willing and dealing on day three of the draft. And could the Steelers, now that they have 2 6-round picks, could they use 1 or 2 of those to move up and target a specific player? Yeah, like absolutely. I mean, I think if you just look at, Omar Khan, the willingness in his first ever draft to go up and get a guy like Broderick Jones, I think, makes a lot of sense. So he's definitely not, I think it's prudent to say that he's willing to be aggressive. So I think that that's definitely something to watch out for. But I'm hoping that the Steelers do move around the board. That was something that I didn't like about Colbert. He was just a guy who liked to stand pat, and that's just was his philosophy. But let's see here. I think this is another trade question. Is there a willing partner? If there is a willing partner, do you trade down the draft to acquire a second round pick or early third round pick? Could get everything that we need in the first 2 days then. Appreciate the question, Matt. I think, it's tough. Like, because I said, I'm kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth here that I like being able to move around the board. It's just difficult to say like this far in advance, right? Like in the moment, you don't, or like before that moment, you don't really know who's going to be available, right? So it's easy to say like right now, oh, can we trade back and get a second or third round pick? Well, yeah, I mean, in a vacuum, that probably sounds good because the Steelers have some needs. We'll talk a little bit about those right now, kind of how I view the roster, but it's not. It could be one of those things where a specific player ends up falling in your lap that you didn't anticipate. And you may not want to feel comfortable trading down from that guy. Or if there are like, you got 2, 3 guys in mind that you're really, trying to get in the first round, guys that graded highly for you. And, say only one of those guys is available. Well, do you want to trade back and risk losing out on that player? So it's just difficult to say. But I mean, I think with the Steelers' needs being what they are right now, I think a trade back makes more sense now than maybe I was originally giving it credit for. Just because I feel like there's a couple of positions that have like glaring weaknesses right now that I could definitely see them wanting to add an extra pick or two to kind of be able to address all of them. So let's see. So this is an interesting question. Kind of get to these two back to back right here from Augusto and Brad. Would you prefer them attack the wide receiver hole through free agency or draft, free agency trade, or through the draft? So this is interesting. I feel like he's probably asking me because I tweeted out and I wrote a little bit about Brandon Ayuk, who's reportedly available from the Niners. Obviously, a guy who's going to be extremely expensive to acquire. I think that if they do allow him to seek a trade like fully and they actually do get rid of him, it's going to cost you. I mean, it's going to cost you a high draft pick, probably a first. And then you're going to have to pay him like a top 5, top 10 receiver on top of that, which is significant. But, when I went back and watched Ayuk's film, man, I mean, he's everything that the Steelers need right now. Like, to be honest with you, he's a guy who can be pressed. He's a 3-level separator. Really good after the catch, bona fide number 1 wide receiver. You look at some of the metrics, he was 7th in receiving yards last year. Efficiency metrics, he was like top 3 in yards per route run, top 3 in yards per reception. So really good player. So, I mean, if you're asking me if I'm cool with like that type of trade, absolutely. Like I'm definitely good with that. The thing is, like with the receiver position, the way it's currently constructed on the roster, the Steelers really need a wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3. I have no problem like slotting George Pickens in as like wide receiver 1 right now. I think that he has the talent to live up to that mantle. But there's not really, I mean, there's not really much behind him in terms of proven experience or proven depth. Calvin Austin the third, I think, is a nice kind of wide receiver 4 type, and then Van Jefferson's coming off probably his least productive season of his like NFL career. So I think that he could be a guy that probably is not even guaranteed necessarily to make the roster, even though I do think that he could carve out a role for himself. But you need a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. Now they've got there's some things that have been going on, I think, behind the scenes. Tyler Boyd, I know that there's an offer on the table for him, Bengals slot receiver. There's also been some teams, Kansas City, Green Bay, or excuse me, not Green Bay, the Jets that have been after him in terms of like wanting him to come play there as well. He's got other suitors. I think maybe he's holding out for a little bit more money. I don't know what the situation is as far as both sides, like how far apart they are on a deal or whatever. There's some interest there. Now, there's really not, there is no wide receiver 2s really available on the market right now, to be honest with you. Like Josh Reynolds was a guy that I talked about on the channel in terms of like a fit that I would like. 29-year-old, like had a really good season for Detroit last season, but there's not really like proven wide receiver 2s available. Like if you want that type of guy, you're gonna have to go get them. I think that they are doing their homework around like the league in terms of maybe some vets that have been available, like Terry McLaurin's can't come about, Deebo Samuel, another Niners wide receiver. Could they make a big move like that before the draft? I don't really know. I assume that if any of those guys get dealt, it's going to be before the draft, right? Especially like the San Francisco guys, because the Niners are in a win now situation. If they're going to deal one of those guys, it's going to be in order to recoup some draft capital to fill those spots with some cheaper talent, and create some cap space. But I'm cool. Like if they want to trade it for a veteran receiver, depending on who it is, I could definitely see that. Now to Brad's question, if the Steelers go wide receiver in round 1, who's projected in their range and who would you rather see them take? I'm a big AD Mitchell guy. Like I feel like I've been talking him up on the channel for a while now. He's a guy, got nice size, really good route runner, extremely fluid for his size, can go up, high point the football. Like I said, can create separation. I think that there are some things that need to be ironed out in terms of like just getting more consistency out of his play on a down-to-down basis, from an effort standpoint, all that stuff. But I would really like to see what he would look like in a really good environment. I thought that the Texas offense, the way it was constructed, I don't think necessarily fit his skill sets the best. I also think that, quarterback play was kind of let him down a little bit as well. I know Quinn Ewers he's a fine college quarterback, but there was a lot of missed opportunities to where his numbers should have been a lot better than what they were, in my opinion. Now the other guy there is Brian Thomas Jr. The LSU Pro Day is coming up. I anticipate that the Steelers are going to be out in full force on that one, man. That's a blue blood type program that they're typically heavily represented in. But Thomas there's been comps, I feel like, with Thomas in terms of like Martavis, like kind of similar type of usage. That LSU offense, man, it was really heavily predicated on, slot fades, go balls. I think I brought this up in the combine review, but Thomas last season, I think he had 12 catches, 500 something yards, and double-digit touchdowns on go balls or fades alone. He really only ran 2 routes. It was either a fade or a hitch. So there is he got better at defeating press, I felt like, this past year, but there's a lot of fine tuning that needs to go on with Thomas's game. So he's to me, his runway may be a little bit deeper in terms of like before you can get a complete wide receiver out of him. Now, could he come in and be a starter in the right situation? Yeah, I think so. You just have to understand, like, this is not a guy that's going to be able to come in and do every single thing. Like he's just not incredibly well-rounded right now, but potential through the roof. Guys with that type of size can run like that. He scored extremely well in the relative athletic score. I want to say is like a 9.95. Just massive, huge catch radius, can blow by everybody. If you think back to like what Martavis was as a rookie back in 2014, like they didn't even start using him until I think it was like week 6, that Houston game. And then Ben, like it was like every week or two, Martavis would catch 1 or 2 deep balls. And that's kind of like what I think Thomas is a little bit further along than that. I also think he's maybe a little bit faster in a straight line than Martavis was, but those guys can carve out roles for themselves. It's just you may have to wait a little bit longer to get the full finished product. But a lot of potential there. Those 2 guys would be, if I'm going to take a guy in the first round based on where they're picking, assuming the guys like the top 3 guys, the consensus guys, Odunze, Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr. obviously going to be well off the board by that time. But in terms of that next kind of tier, if they were going to go receiver, those two are the guys that I think that they would be interested in, and also the guys that I probably would be the most interested in as well. Um, New wide receivers coach Zach Azzani was also represented at the Texas Pro Day. Tony Pauline of Pro Football Network said that they spent a good amount of time with Xavier Worthy as well. Another Texas receiver. He's a smaller guy, only about 160 pounds. He's a featherweight, but broke the combine record for the 40. Absolute maniac, electric speed. So those guys are definitely in the mix. So really interesting player though. Do you think that Van Pran from Georgia could be a starter day one or just the consensus top three center? So I think Matt's referring to the consensus top three is Jackson Powers Johnson from Oregon, Zach Frazier from West Virginia, and probably Graham Barton from Duke. Now, Barton's a little bit different because he hasn't played center since his freshman year at Duke, but played tackle. But he's a guy who's got really good tape. I think he can make the transition. But will the Steelers be willing to consider like somebody like that? Because I think he's going to go probably somewhere in the first round, even if it's later in the first round. Would they be willing to go, down that road again, trying to bring somebody in that necessarily isn't a true center? I'm not really sure, but I think that Van Pran does have starter potential. Starter day one, I don't know. Like he was a guy that I had him in the third round range. When I went back and watched him, I probably studied him most around like October, November. But my notes for him was I felt like he was a solid athlete. But some of the concerns that I had, just like the lateral change of direction, like when like in terms of like picking up stunts or whenever he was asked to like mirror quicker guys up the middle, I just feel like it was a little bit lacking there. And he is a little bit smaller, or not an incredible mass guy, but I felt like he held up almost better against like bigger rushers than he did against like speed guys or whenever they would walk backers or loop or do any type of game up front. But he's got starter potential. Starting him day one, I mean, he's a guy who has played a lot of football for Georgia, man, in the SEC. Those guys typically are experienced enough to step right in and at least like try to be a contributor. I think anytime you're starting a rookie center, though, I mean, expectations have to be tempered in that regard. But I don't think Van Pran, in my opinion, has the type of ceiling that, Jackson Powers Johnson does, from Oregon. That's kind of the guy that if they're going to address that position, that's probably the guy that I would prefer, even though he's going to cost you the highest pick probably. But Van Pran's a solid player. See what else we got here. If you are the GM, what is your move if we don't add anyone else in free agency? Excuse me. I think that's a tough one, Richie, because I'm not really exactly 100% sure. I'm guessing you're talking about how the draft would go. For Martin's questions, if when more signings come in, do you expect them to be before or after the draft? I don't think they're done before the draft, man. I would be really surprised if that was the case. And the reason is because, I just look at the roster right now. There's some significant holes. Typically, you go back historically and look at how the Steelers have handled free agency, right? A lot of the times they sign these baseline starters, these veteran guys on their second contract, and then they'll end up drafting the same position in the first three rounds. Really, those guys are kind of like the quote-unquote placeholders, right? Like you think back to how they signed like Morgan Burnett from the Packers and then immediately drafted Terrell Evans in the first round. Now, Burnett signing obviously didn't work out, but there's a lot of those type examples of them signing vets and then drafting immediately over them. That's kind of just how they've always done business. Now, what is weird, I think, about this whole situation is the free agency class was actually there was a lot of options available at the center position. They didn't show any interest in any of them. And there's not really a center on the roster right now. So I think it's strange to me personally. I think the most competent center option available on the roster is probably James Daniels, but he's been playing so well at guard. And some of the struggles he had in Chicago is because they kept moving him around every season. He's playing a different position. He played center, he played left guard, he played right guard. Now that they've got him in one spot, I would be looking at extending James Daniels, as a guard. He's, the guard market's kind of blown up a little bit. He's played really well. He's been rock solid in pass protection. I would not want to move him to center. And I know some people, I think maybe Khan made a comment about Nate Herbig. I don't think he's a center. I definitely don't think he's a center in a wide zone system. And the other thing that's interesting about that is like Arthur Smith's offense, like you have to be able to run the football. If the Steelers do not run the football next year, they're cooked on offense. It just is what it is. There's That's what this offense is predicated around. In order to do that, like you have to, in my opinion, have a plus run blocker at the pivot. You look at Arthur Smith's offenses in Tennessee with Ben Jones and Atlanta with Drew Dahlman. Some of those guys that can move, get out in space, get those reach blocks executed. You got to have a good center, man. So it's important for them to nail that position. Now, who knows what really happens with that, but so center right now, a glaring weakness that they just didn't address at all. And then I think if you look at it too, they decided to trade away Deontay Johnson. We've already kind of talked about the decision, why that had to happen, the return with Dante Jackson, but you created another hole on the roster because they went into the offseason probably needing a wide receiver 3, right? With Allen Robinson being cut, let go, needing more production from that spot as a receiver. And then, you let go of your arguably number 1, what wide receiver 2, whatever. You got to replace that production. So how are you going to do that? Now, I think going into the draft, even though there are several centers that we just talked about that are going to be in play early in the draft, this wide receiver class is freaking loaded. I mean, dude, there's so many good players. I mean, I was sitting there trying to like do my rank, like I'm trying to like fine tune my rankings. I'm like, it's so hard to leave some of these guys out of the top 10. Having said that, though, I don't necessarily love the fact of like this idea of, oh, we'll just go into the draft and we'll get a receiver and a center with the first 2 picks. Could they get good players? Absolutely. But it kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier of you don't really know what's going to be there, right? Like say a cornerback ends up falling that you have an incredibly high grade on. For example, like let's just say like Terrion Arnold from Alabama. Let's just say the Steelers, they met with him formally at the combine. Arnold's tape is fantastic. He's a very good athlete. He's exactly what they need in the secondary. All right. He's inside outside capable. He's a really good tackler. He's a playmaker on the football. He's a guy who you could play as a rookie in the slot. And then Dante Jackson, when he walks next season, you could slide him out to the boundary. And then you could still, like, as time moves on, you could rotate him into the slot and passing situations, whatever you want to do. But an outstanding player. Say he's your, let's just say theory, say he's your 8th ranked player on your board. Well, like what happens if you get to pick 20 and Jackson Powers Johnson's gone and maybe only one of the receivers between Thomas or Mitchell's there. But let's just say you have Mitchell as the 23rd player on your board. Well, now it's between your 23rd player or your 8th player, and you need both positions, but wide receiver is a bigger need. That's how you get into the situation of like drafting specifically for need, and you're not able to take advantage of those guys that kind of fall, even though they're not supposed to. And I'm just using Terry Arnold as an example, only because Quinyon Mitchell's destroyed the pre-draft process. It wouldn't surprise me if he was the first corner off the board. Arnold to me is CB1. It wouldn't surprise me if somebody fell in love with Nate Wiggins. We'll see how that all plays out. I like all those guys' games, but I'm just using that as an example. If you start getting into the situation where you're drafting solely for need, you're kind of just pigeonholing yourself in and you're eliminating potential options that could kind of fall into your lap. And you just never know what could happen. Draft weekend's crazy, which I think goes back to kind of like what Penguin's saying. Who do you think drops the most during the draft? I mean, man, I feel like that's so difficult. There are a couple guys like rumored to go like first round that I just don't really see as first round players. But all in all, I mean, one thing I think like people just don't take enough into account is the draft. Like these teams' draft boards, they're usually only about like 120 players deep, even though there's 350 plus eligible prospects or something like that. It's everybody's board looks completely different. So I don't necessarily say like sometimes like when guys drop out, I don't necessarily love saying, oh, well, that's just how the NFL feels about them. Well, like it's not necessarily the case. I mean, a guy could fall out of the first round. Like, for example, like Brian Branch. Brian Branch last year was a top 10 prospect for me in the draft. Loved him. He didn't test well. I think we kind of knew that he was going to fall a little bit just because people fall in love with the testing and athleticism matters. I talked about this. I'm a big, like, I think athleticism matters, but when the tape's excellent, like Branches was, I was willing to say, okay, he's just an average to solid athlete, but he's a great football player. I'd still take him high. Great season for Detroit. We'll see how that works out for them long-term. But could it be somebody like that where, maybe Branch was the second best player on 3 teams' boards and he just barely got passed over? Maybe not everybody had a second round grade on him like he ended up going, but But that's what I'm talking about. Like it does happen. Like some players will end up falling that we don't necessarily anticipate, or players that shouldn't fall, I should say. And I just think you want to construct your roster to where you don't pigeonhole yourself in a draft in just one or two positions early for that specific reason. So let's see. With the current roster, who would you target round one if we made no extra moves? I mean, I think like it comes down to a couple players for me. All guys that I think I would be like happy with. Amarius Mims from Georgia, tackle, right tackle. But I will say this: I personally, and people may not agree with this, but I feel probably more comfortable with Dan Moore at left tackle than I do with Nate Herbig at center, or with Van Jefferson or Calvin Austin as wide receiver too. So tackle right now is probably not their biggest need. So maybe you could make the argument that maybe Marius Mims doesn't make as much sense as some of these other guys. I've said really throughout, shout out to my guy, Nick Martin. He was a guy who really put Jackson Powers Johnson like on my radar like several months ago. I was blown away by his film. I think he's got like legitimate all pro type of ceiling. We'll see if he gets there, but I think he's phenomenal. The way he moves at his size, how good he already is, with still some room to grow in terms of like with his hand placement, but he's an awesome player. So like even taking a center at 20, even though it's not a quote unquote like premier position, I think he's got the chance to be a premier player. So I would have no problem taking him as well. And if they took a receiver, like AD Mitchell's still the guy that I think like makes the most sense. He would probably be the guy that I'd want. I think that him and Pickens will give them a really, really talented duo, in the future to kind of come and, build whoever the quarterback's going to be, whether it's, Fields, whether it's a rookie next year, whatever it looks like. Um, you know, Gingerola, what position player would you like the Steelers to take in the second round? All depends on how the first round goes. I mean, I think Zach Frazier has been the one that you guys have mocked the most to the Steelers in the second round. I feel like every time somebody sends me a mock, it's got Zach Frazier in it. If they don't go center in the first, I think if Frazier was there at 50 or whatever, I think he makes a good amount of sense. He might be somebody that I have to trade up a little bit for. Now, I would say this about Frazier. Like, I personally, it's just my opinion, I don't know that he's the caliber of prospect that I would feel comfortable taking at 20, just because I don't see that. I don't see the same like all pro caliber upside with Frazier. The wrestling background, the way that he gets guys onto the ground, I think that there are a lot of things to work with in terms of like, he does have a pretty solid first step. He can function in this wide zone offense. I think he's a good player. In order for me to take a non-premium position player in the first, like I've got to have like some type of like significant upside. And I think that Frazier has the chance to be a solid to good starter. I just don't see like the type of upside that I do with JPJ, but he's the guy in the second. Some other guys, like in terms of, receiver options that could potentially be available. I've talked about some day two receivers that I really like for the Steelers. Ricky Pearsall from Florida, guy that I like. Jalen McMillan from Washington. He'd be more probably like his consensus board stuff looks around their third round pick, but those kind of are guys that I could see on day two. But yeah. Let's see. This is a good question. I remember reading this last night. A list of players who would surprisingly drop close enough to where the Steelers would contemplate trading up in the first. For example, Brock Bowers, Fashanu, Quinyon Mitchell. How far would they have to drop? 14, 15, what cost? Now, that's a good question. Now, I will say, as of right now, I think the Steelers have too many needs to talk about really, moving up significantly for a prospect and like the top, like in the early teens and things like that, just because, like I said, they don't have a wide receiver two on the roster. They don't have a center on the roster right now. Now, if those things get taken care of, say they do figure out a way to get one of those holes, I think going into the draft, one of those two holes needs to be filled. Like, I think that you at least need some type of, even if it's not a long-term starter, you need somebody that you're capable of starting next season and getting decent play out of before you go into the draft. It's just my opinion. But if one of those two holes gets available, I would consider trading up for Terrion Arnold. Any of the guys that you listed outside of Bowers, I wouldn't really have a problem with. Fashanu, excellent pass protector. I mean, the kid's still incredibly young. He was awesome last year. I haven't actually even watched his 2023 film because his 2022 film was so good. I'm going to try to watch like probably 2 games of him, but his 2022 tape was so awesome. Bowers to me, I, I've seen more Bowers stuff recently. I just feel like, I mean, the Steelers have two tight ends. It's one of the stronger position groups on the roster. I think Bowers is an awesome player. I mean, he's more like big slot y rather than just like pure tight end or Y tight end. But um, Terry on Arnold would be my answer to that. I love Arnold to death, man. I think he's an awesome player. Um, do you think there's other available cornerbacks that the Steelers can go after? Man, to be honest with you, I don't really think so. I think most of the market is pretty dry. I mean, they could make a move at like slot corner or something like that that I think would make some sense. Chandon Sullivan's still a free agent. Maybe they bring back him or Pat Pete to kind of as a placeholder in the slot. Maybe that move doesn't even happen until after the draft. I don't know. Um, but there were some cornerback options out there. I mean, I thought, especially for like what they got, not the greatest athlete in the world, but a solid one. I thought Kendall Fuller made a lot of sense. I mean, he ended up signing for, I think, like 2 for 16 or something like that in Miami. And like, it wasn't even 16 fully guaranteed. I want to say it was lower than that with some incentives. Like he could have been, you talk about getting a plus player in the slot. He's played mostly outside in Washington, but I think he's just as well suited for the slot as, he's played there some early in his career. But he was a guy that I thought that they may go after. But I don't know. I mean, this is a good cornerback class too. They can there's cornerbacks late day 2, even early into day 3. Like I've talked about, the Florida State kids, Green and Jones. Those two are guys that, will probably go a little bit later that I think could potentially be fits for them. But what the heck are they doing at center and tackle? I'm gonna explode. I don't know, man. It is very interesting to me. I will say that I thought the first week of free agency, I mean, it was crazy. It was great for content. Channel blew up last week. I really appreciate everybody's support too. But they were pretty busy, and I liked seeing it. I was admittedly surprised that they were just quiet as a mouse this past week. Typically that first week of free agency is crazy, and then it does die down. But for them to just go basically AWOL for an entire week, I was a little surprised by that. But I think that the center thing is just the thing that surprises me, I think, the most. When they released Mason Cole early, I think we could all understand the rationale behind that because he didn't fit the system. He coming off a really bad year, could save some cap space, whatever. But I thought they'd at least go get like some type of baseline starter to where they didn't need to rush a rookie in or pigeonhole themselves into taking a center early. I feel like that's kind of what they've done. I mean, the only real option out there right now is Connor Williams, and like Drew Rosenhaus's agent has said that he's not signing anytime soon. He's coming off that significant leg injury, so he's a guy who, I mean, there's been even some whispers around saying that like he may retire. So free agent options are not. They're pretty much picked through at this point. I do think that there is a scenario where Dan Moore is going to be a starter at one of the tackle spots. I know y'all are not going to want to hear that, but I said that a week ago, and everybody said, or actually, I think I said that before free agency, and everybody was saying like I was crazy, whatever. But the Steelers like Dan Moore better than like I feel like most of us or most of the media or most of like the fan base does. It just that's just the truth. I don't know. Don't shoot the messenger. Devin, interested to see what your ideal draft for them would be. Man, I'm going to come out with my second. I usually do 3 mock drafts. I'm going to come out with my second mock draft for Steelers now. I think it's going to drop on Monday. I've already started working on it. But, man, I try to be pretty open-minded with the draft. I mean, I give my honest feedback. I mean, I watch so many of these players. There will inevitably be prospects that they take or a prospect that they take that I may not like as much from a prospect standpoint. But just draft good players, man. Just draft good players. I know it sounds simple, but at least draft players I think that like at least makes sense. It's tricky with the draft because you're always drafting, like you're not just drafting for talent, you're not just drafting for need. Ideally it's some type of blend or combination of those two things, and the best GMs, they're able to do that. I will say that like my confidence level in Omar Khan's sky high, man. Like he killed last year's draft class. Last year's draft class was probably my favorite Steelers draft class. They didn't pick a single player that I was just, I won't say upset because I'm not really ever upset necessarily of a draft pick, but they got so many good values last year, I felt like, in the draft, and everything made sense. And a lot of those guys had extremely good rookie seasons, like Joey Porter Jr., Keanu Benton, even Broderick. I thought played well at times. Even with the struggles in pass protection. So Collins got my confidence. I'm excited to see who they get, but I think ideal draft right now, like, got to get a center, got to get a receiver. I think those two things are absolutely true. Ideally, if you could get a tackle, some depth along the defensive line, I think would be nice. They probably need to add a cornerback as well, especially if they don't, add even like a cheaper slot corner closer to the draft, which I think is definitely possible. But we'll see what happens there. I mean, I think right now, center, wide receiver 2, the biggest kind of, I think, question marks on the roster. So I think I got everybody, but I really appreciate you guys tapping in with me for the video free agency recap. Let me know in the comments, like, if you guys have questions. I know I put it out there for Twitter, but I know a lot of you guys maybe don't have Twitter. So if y'all got questions for me, drop them in the chat or the comment box, and I'll try to get back with y'all. Just again, leave me a like on your way out. Make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications. I appreciate you guys. We crossed the 6,000 sub mark. So far, it is the 23rd of March. We are like right on the edge of a historic month for the channel across the board. Subs, hours, views, everything. And we've still got almost a week to go. So I really appreciate your all support. My sincere love goes out to you guys for supporting me no matter what. So you guys have a good rest of your weekend, and I will holler at you guys next time. Peace and love.